one more kind of housekeeping things, John, if it's okay with you. I usually like to do the presentation interactively so folks can ask questions along the way, if that makes sense. I think it works better that way rather than wait until the end, if that's all right. And we can do one of two things with questions because they are recording it. I just found this cord has an impressive amount of cord on it, so I can kind of hold the microphone close to you, or I could also repeat the questions too, so that everyone's aware of watching it later. If that's okay. That sound good? All right, super. So tonight I'm going to sort of give you a few different elements of CPA to talk about. First, I'll just quickly tell you about our organization. We're going to climb up to like 40,000 feet cruising altitude and get a good look at CPA, overall, statewide, and then dig down into some of the allowable uses and the finer points of CPA and some of the best practices. So that's the agenda for tonight. And I'll start with our organization. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called the Community Preservation Coalition. And we are based in Boston, but we're really just a combobulation of all these other nonprofits in the open space, recreation, affordable housing, and historic world in Massachusetts. We have a 21-member steering committee, including folks from local CPCs like yourself, and at-large members, and then someone from each of these nonprofits sits on the CPC as well, usually the chief executive of those organizations. We're based at this one, the Trust for Public Land. We've been there for close to 20 years now. Before that, I think we were at CHAPA for a while, then they passed us off to Preservation Massachusetts, but we've been home at TPL's office, which we love because it's a block from the State House. So we spend a lot of time there. We're going to talk about that tonight, but that's been a good home base for us to be in their offices. And the things we do for CPA are typical of a municipal trade association, I guess is the best term to describe them. Every board or committee in town has someone at the statewide level, usually a nonprofit, that represents their interests, that advocates for them at Beacon Hill, that does technical assistance, trainings like this one, websites, newsletters, and things like that. And we're that organization for the now 200 towns and cities that have CPA, and in particular the Community Preservation Committee in those organizations. So these are all the different things that we offer as services. The two that I'll highlight that I think are the best thing we do is our technical assistance. We answer probably 4,000 calls on CPA. Raise your hand if you've ever reached out to the coalition for a question. Okay, great. So we love talking to communities. It makes us better. We learn stuff every day. I was telling Ann, you've been chair of the CPC for a long time. And we all still learn something every day. I learn things new about CPA every day, and it usually comes from those interactions we have with communities about technical assistance, because we learn great ideas like, never thought of using CPA for that. That is a great idea. And the next thing we know, we read an article, it's on our website, it's in our newsletter, and it's in our next technical assistance training. So we love that interaction. And then the other thing would be our advocacy work on Beacon Hill. You could probably find or pay a lawyer for an answer to a technical assistance question on CPA, but you're probably not going to hop in the car and drive to Boston and meet with the legislators who are trying to change CPA in a way that's not good, or to advocate for more money for the trust fund, or changes that might be positive. That's the one thing that we do that I think is invaluable for communities, because it's something that's really hard for you folks to do yourselves. That being said, we can never get anything passed at the State House ourselves. And that's why in all our legislative efforts, over 25 years, all the victories we have been when we reached out to the communities and said, hey, we're getting close on this, we need your help. And you talk to your local legislators and stuff happens. Yeah, John.
Are there certain legislators that you routinely reach out to for assistance? Are there certain legislators that are very supportive of CPA?
Yes. Luckily, our State House is really supportive of CPA in general. We have a tracking sheet that we really don't do anymore because it's not necessary, but of every legislative district in Massachusetts and what CPA communities are in that district. And in the Senate, either 39 or I think it's all 40 now, have a CPA community in their district. And in the House, it's like 130 out of the 160 House members. So when you have CPA communities in your district, you tend to be interested in helping them out with CPA, or you're probably not going to get votes from that town, later on. So we have great support at the State House. There are some folks in the legislative world, they'll call it champions, that we go to over and over again because they have some interest in CPA. We have some senators where every town in their district has CPA, and those folks are more highly motivated to help out with CPA. So the issue we're having now is, very honestly, with COVID and the State House was closed, we were the last State House in the country to open, like a year after the second to last opened up. So we went a long time without seeing folks and meeting with them in person. And then over those years, a lot of folks have left the State House. It's a hard job, it's nonstop, it's 24/7, and we've had a lot of folks retire who were really senior level people who we had great experience with, and so they leave and someone brand new comes in, and you got to start the process all over again. So that's where we're at right now, is we're meeting a lot of new legislators now, and building up our new set of champions as we go along. So long answer to a very pointed short question. The last thing I'll say about us is I always like to be upfront about where we get the money to operate our organization, because it's an important thing to know. We are a nonprofit, and we do raise money the way most nonprofits do, asking for foundation grants and things like that. But probably 75% of our funding is pretty unique. It comes from you and the communities using a little piece of their administrative fund voluntarily to support us. It is not required. It's not something you have to do, but we're really honored that 99.9% of all the communities in the state see the value in all this and are willing to support us. So thank you very much for that. We really appreciate it. All right. I want to talk a little bit about our website. Hopefully you've all seen our website, but there's a particular tab that I want to point out. This technical assistance tab is really created for you, for community preservation committees. And it opens up this large menu, and you click through, and there's literally hundreds of ideas and articles and best practices and all sorts of things on there. So if you're looking for some information on CPA, this would be a great first place to start. And if you don't find what you're looking for, then you pick up the phone or shoot us an email, and we'll help you out. Chase Mack, our communications director, actually Chase was, that was him right there, campaigning in Milton on election day during COVID with his wife, holding signs at the poll. Chase spends a lot of time on that website, and it's a really good resource. You won't find anything on CPA on the state of Massachusetts website. Not a darn thing. You'll find maybe the spreadsheet for the state match, and that's about it, because there is no department or person anywhere in the state government that has CPA in their job title. They don't spend a penny administering this program. They consider it to be a local program. People think we're a state agency all the time, which is both good and bad, right? There's no infrastructure to support CPA at the state level. So in terms of websites, that's why we take ours really seriously, as we know there's no alternative from the state to find out information on CPA. So you are the first folks to see this brand new slide where we changed that number from 196 to 200 from the elections on Tuesday, which is pretty exciting to reach that milestone. And that's about a little over 50% of the towns in Massachusetts. But because we've had a lot of cities join CPA in the past decade, we're now darn close to 3/4 of the people in Massachusetts living in a CPA community. And so it's been a huge success. I love this bottom stat. I don't know if we'll be able to say that bottom stat forever, but so far, all 200 that have ever adopted the program are still in the program. Not one community has exited the program, and that tells me that folks find it pretty good and pretty useful, which is great. I wish I could claim credit for having written the original law, but I wasn't involved back then. I have been at the coalition since 2006, and before that I was chairman of my local CPC in Boxford, Massachusetts on the North Shore for 5 years. So I have been working on CPA since 2000. But the folks that put it together and worked with the legislature really did a great job on this law. It's very unique to Massachusetts. There's nowhere else that has anything like this. And it only works because of our little hyper-local, home rule town meeting control in Massachusetts. This is the CPA map. The orange is the cities that have CPA, and the green are the towns. And those yellow stars are the 11 communities that were on the ballot on Tuesday. It's kind of interesting. You'd think after 24 years now, any town that really wanted to have CPA would have adopted it by now, and there wouldn't be a heck of a lot of interest. But we had 11 new towns thinking about CPA 24 years after it's been around, voting on it for the first time. And there are the towns on the bottom of the screen. Unfortunately, it was not a great election. CPA wins far more than it loses, especially on presidential ballots. For a while, I think for the first 4 presidential cycles that happened since 2000, CPA had never lost if it was on a presidential ballot. It was something like 21-0. So this is the first time we've had a situation where more towns failed on the presidential ballot than passed. 4 passed and 7 failed. The 4 that passed were Sheffield. You had to be toward the end of the alphabet to pass this time. Sheffield, Swampscott, Townsend, and Winchester were the 4 that passed. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. The national discourse, I think, doesn't help. Economic times are kind of mixed and a little challenging, at least perception of it is. And maybe the biggest thing is that there were so many statewide ballot questions. Anyone have trouble getting through those 5 meaty, really complicated statewide ballot questions? I mean, they were tough ones, and they were long and challenging. My wife and I debated how we were going to vote, for a month ahead of time, going, back and forth and discussing it. They were hard ones. And, not everyone has the patience to sit through all those. And CPA is question 6. It's always, the local questions are always after the statewide questions. So we had a ton of blanks on the CPA ballots of these 11 towns. Far more blanks that would have made up the difference between the yes and no vote. But, it's not for everybody. And the silver lining is, 11 towns would have increased the trust fund even more and, made smaller slices of the current pie. So that's where we're at in terms of number of communities. The success of CPA is definitely looking at that map and seeing all those communities. And it's also on this slide showing the statistics of what's happened from CPA. Welcome. Come on in. Hi. You are also the very first folks to see these new stats because Chase just finished tabulating all the data from FY23. You folks put the CPA data into the state's database. They run a database to collect projects, and then we analyze it and crunch the numbers and slice and dice and fix errors and all that and come up with these final statistics, which Chase just finished this week. So there have been 17,000 different projects approved. And this is the number that always surprises folks. CPA has raised almost $3.5 billion with a B just since 2000 for CPA projects. So that's not an insignificant amount of money for a restricted fund that can only be used for 4 things. So it's really a terrific funding source. And you can see the data of all the things that have been done with CPA. It's a pretty big success. I think the affordable housing piece is the toughest one. We're going to talk about that tonight. That's a challenge for a lot of communities. And I think the legislature is really watching very carefully to see how communities do with housing, since it is the #1 issue right now in Massachusetts. And I also do think that our future state matches and the ability and the willingness of the legislature to devote more money to the trust fund is going to hinge on how we do with housing here in the coming years. So we'll talk about that tonight. All right, so let's dig in a little. Let's lower the plane to 20,000 feet and talk about CPA from a revenue and allowable uses perspective. So there are 2 main funding sources with CPA. The local surcharge revenue, that's each town sets how much money they want to collect to put into their CPA fund anywhere from 0.5%. I think we have one community left at 0.5%, all the way up to 3%. We have about 70 communities that are at 3%. Is anyone, Mendon's at 3%, right? Anyone else in the room at 3? Upton has 3% too? Okay, great. That's by and large, that's the largest funding source, obviously. And then there's an annual distribution from the Department of Revenue from the CPA trust fund. The trust fund actually is something that is kind of confusing to a lot of folks. So I always like to dig into the trust fund a little bit, because it's surprising where the money comes from for some folks. The money's collected and is paid out every November to communities. So next week is actually the biggest week of the year for CPA. It's trust fund distribution week, so you're going to get another email from us. We sent out an email today, a newsletter about the elections, and next week we'll be sending one out on the state match. But we get a little peek ahead of time of what the match might be. And the trust fund has run into some static the past few years. The biggest reason why is interest rates. They've been very high for a long time. CPA made a lot of money for the trust fund from refinancings. Every time people refinance their mortgage as interest rates are going down, that generated money for CPA at the registry. No one's refinancing right now at the registries of deeds. So, we are definitely at it ebbs and flows with the trust fund depending upon registry activities. We're in an ebb right now for sure. We've also been able to get surplus funds from the state budget over the past 10 years. It's a little over $100 million of surplus funds, so that's another funding source that we've had. That one is not built into the law. It's not automatic. We have to advocate for it every year. And we didn't get any last year, and we're not going to get any this year, and probably not next year because the state is not very flush with cash right now. So there isn't a surplus. So you combine, higher interest rates and less activity at the registry with no surplus funds, and then new communities still adopting CPA. We have 6 that are going to get their first match next week. And that all adds up to a pretty low match historically with CPA. The Department of Revenue projected a 14% match in the spring. It is going to be higher than that. Could be as high as 17, maybe even 18%, just from our back of the envelope chicken scratch calculations. But that's low historically. When CPA first started, for the first 6 years, it was 100% match. Anne's nodding her head; she remembers those days. And those days are long gone. I mean, CPA is too big now to manage. It would take a lot of money to feed into the system. It would take 200 this year. Would have taken $205 million to give everyone 100% match, and that's a gigantic state program. That's the entire Department of Education budget in the state of Massachusetts. I'm making that up, but you can get the idea that that kind of money is not just hanging around. So when we say a 14% match, by the way, we mean a 14% match of what you raised locally. Everyone gets the same percentage on the first round of the trust fund, and it's a percentage of what you raised locally. So this year, Boston, gets 27 million or so from CPA. If the match ended up being 14.4, and like I said, it'll be a little higher, Boston would get a check for 14.4% of 26 million. Our smallest CPA community is Gosnold. Anyone know where Gosnold is, by the way?
New town I've never heard of. Oh my God.
Oh, there's lots of them.
351.
Yeah. Do you know Peru?
Yes.
Florida?
Yes.
Hawley? I just met someone today from
I
Hawley.
I just go out because I've worked in so many different places, but it amazes me. I still find places I've never heard of.
Yeah, and it's fun. I got so excited today when I met someone from Hawley, spelled Hawley, I think. In any case, Gosnold. What about Cuttyhunk? Anyone heard of Cuttyhunk? Okay, that usually brings a few nods. We have 3 sets of islands in Massachusetts. We don't just have Nantucket. We don't just have Martha's Vineyard, but then there's that long, thin stretch of islands off Falmouth, and it's called the Elizabeth Islands. And Cuttyhunk is the populated one all the way down the bottom. Big destination for sailors. But the town, all the islands together form a town, population, I don't know, year-round 50 maybe. In the summer, there's about 400 people in Cuttyhunk. They get $5,000 a year from CPA. So they would get a check for 14.4% of 5,000. So that's the way the trust fund match works. If you're at 3%, you get more because there's a second and third round of funding, which has a little bit more. But that's what we mean when we talk about a 14% match for the CPA trust fund. So, by the way, the one other thing I'll say about the trust fund is folks often think that the money comes from the state budget. You know, that we go up just like any other, nonprofit and works for 6 months when the state's doing its budget from January through July, advocating and trying to get an increase in our funds. That is not the way it works for CPA. It's much better than that. The trust fund was set up as a dedicated fee collected at the Registry of Deeds on every document that is filed in this Commonwealth of Massachusetts at any of the 26 registries. So you go to a registry and you're holding your mortgage in hand that has to be recorded at the registry, or your deed, or an order of declaration for your Conservation Commission new deck that you're doing, whatever it is that you have to record at the registry, you step up to the window, you give them the document, and there's a chart there that shows a fee for recording that document. Most of that fee goes to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts General Fund, but $50 of every piece of paper filed at the registry goes to CPA. And it is a true trust fund. It goes right from the window at the registry to the Department of Revenue and is deposited in an interest-bearing account called the CPA Trust Fund. And statutorily, the only thing the legislature can do with that money is pay it out to you, CPA communities, as a match every November 15th. Yeah, go on.
Stuart, I don't want to derail your presentation. But
Right.
who came up with this idea? Were a bunch of guys sitting around smoking something?
That is-
got this idea.
That is the greatest
Let's-
question. All
Let's
right.
put a fee on top of the deeds and
Yeah.
pass the money out.
It was actually, they cycled through probably about a dozen different ideas before they arrived at that one. The gentleman who thought of CPA was from out this way. His name was Bob Duran. Does that name ring a bell to anyone? If you're in the land community, he was a big environmentalist. He was a state senator from Marlboro,
Yep.
state rep from Marlboro, then a state senator. He filed the bill, I think, when he was a rep, and then carried it through when he was a senator, and then was appointed by Governor Cellucci, who's also from the Hudson Marlboro area, to be Secretary of the Environment. And when he finally got to Secretary of the Environment, he was able to push CPA over the finish line. He started it modeling on the Nantucket and Cape Cod land banks. But then he chaired a special commission on historic preservation, and he said, well, let's put historic into it, And then he was involved with a bunch of organizations for housing, and he said, well, that really is a good match because it's all land use issues, and of course, open space morphed into recreation. So, it wasn't always, it took a while. It took 10 years to kind of formulate, to come together, and there was a large constituency of organizations that worked with Bob to get it done. I will tell you that I think the idea of the local surcharge being a surcharge on your property taxes is actually the more creative idea, actually. Because we have Prop 2.5 in Massachusetts, which says towns cannot raise their property taxes more than 2.5% every year. That's codified in our state and sacrosanct. So there is no other way to generate revenue for municipalities. And so that was actually the interesting idea, to kind of do a permanent Prop 2.5 override, 0.5% to 3%. Ideas were floated both on the state side and the local side to make it a transfer tax. When you sell a house, 1% of that house sale would go into the CPA fund. The realtors hate that, and they will dig in tooth and nail. And so when CPA was really stuck for a long time when it was thinking about making it based on a transfer tax, and as soon as they switched to the funding sources we have now as an idea, then it took off and passed. So the realtors still hate it, but that's okay.
Is he still alive?
Oh, Bob, absolutely.
We
So,
should send him a thank you note.
I talk to him all the time. He was actually after he left state government, his second career was as a lobbyist in the environmental space, and so we hired him to help us with our legislation. That fee that I talk about at the Registry of Deeds, that was actually $20 per document when CPA was first passed, and that was fine for the 30 communities that had CPA in the beginning, but it quickly became not fine as CPA became more popular. And so we worked for a dozen years to get that fee raised finally, and in 2019 we got it raised from $20 to $50, which was a big jump, which was great. We had already lost about half of the $20 fee to inflation by 2019. So, so Bob was integral, whatever that word is. He was it for that bill, actually, and so he still helps us out all the time. Really a terrific person and very, very smart, and then they love him up at the State House too. All right, so now let's, any questions on the trust fund or the money, the local money, the match? No? All right.
In terms of, you said
Yeah.
affordable housing might be a way that the state maybe awards more funding to towns.
Yep.
Would this be another modification of the act? And then they would, if you do X percentage of your funding for affordable housing, then you would get an extra, even if you're only 1%.
Yep.
You get an extra bump.
I think if the legislature, had its way right now, they would probably be moving to something like that. We always feel the magic of CPA is in the local control. Each town gets to decide what they want to do with the money. Because frankly, at this point, it's 85% their money and 15% from the trust fund. So we'll always defend the rights of communities to spend the money in the way they see fit. In one town, it's all about buying land. My town has never met a piece of open space that we didn't want to buy. Ann's town is probably in that group too. Upton as well, yeah. Sweet William Farm, some great victories in Upton. But in Plymouth, it is all about historic preservation. Salem, all about historic preservation. In Boston and Cambridge and Springfield, it's all about housing. So that's the magic of CPA, right? As long as you pay attention to all four categories and do some in each, the rest is up to you. And so I think we'll defend that right to the end. On the other hand, we do have to recognize that the state's biggest problem right now is housing. And they want to see CPA doing more with housing. We do have a lot of communities that really don't do their share with housing. So we have to finesse that. We have to find a way. And I think the best solution is to do it with carrots rather than sticks. The realtors, frankly, have proposed taking away the CPA match if your community doesn't do enough housing. What enough is I don't know. But that's not a good way to deal with CPA. It's a voluntary tax. If you dictate to communities, they'll just say, well, what do we need this program for anymore if we're going to be told what to do? So it's a difficult issue. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And remind me when we do to talk about the $50 million grant to CPA for good housing communities that we had some action on last year.
Our concern, our problem in Grafton is we don't have enough money to do anything with affordable housing with the funds that we collect.
Right.
We could build a unit.
Right.
One unit's better than no units, but it's not even a drop in the bucket. So
Right.
again, that's why if they have all the money at the state to say, okay, if you're gonna do, 20% of your budget for affordable housing, you're gonna be eligible for grants for $20 million.
Yeah.
You have to fight for your grant, but at least there's a bigger pot that you can go.
All right, well, so now I might as well talk about it right now. So that is a great idea. That's a carrot, right? That's not a stick. That's a carrot. You want to go for it? Go for it, And so we promoted that idea at the legislature because in advocating for extra surplus funds this year, they were like, the state doesn't have any extra right now, and by the way, we wouldn't give it to you probably anyways because we feel there's some work that needs to be done on the housing, which is true. So working with them, the idea of creating a $50 million grant program to be given to communities that do some percentage of their work on housing that's, above the norm, right? And we actually got it passed in the Senate. I don't know if any of you remember, the legislature broke for the session on July 31st, and the July was like a flurry of activity, all sorts of major bills. It was the craziest July I've ever seen. A lot of them got done, a lot of them didn't get done. The bill that we were a part of with that $50 million came out of the Senate, but it hadn't passed the House, so it goes into what's called the Conference Committee. And when it came out of the Conference Committee, the $50 million was gone, as was about 3/4 of the bill. So what they passed, they called a skinny bill. They left so much on the cutting floor just so they could get it passed by July 31st in time. It was called the Affordable Homes Act. And it has a lot of great stuff in there, including a huge amount of money, $2 billion, to fix up our housing authority units, because the state has really not done a good job of that. But our program hit the floor. And so, but I think, it's a good idea, and I think we'll see it come back around. Hopefully we'll have more time to work on it, because everything that I just told you happened in a span of like 48 hours. It was there, it got passed in the Senate, it was great, everyone was loving it. Went into conference committee, came out in the middle of the night, and it was gone, and it was over. That idea is going to come around again. It usually takes 2 to 3 legislative sessions to get anything done. There's 7,000 bills filed every year, and they pass maybe 200 to 300 of them, and a lot of them are local bills to, rename the overpass in Upton, or in Grafton, the John Stevens Memorial Overpass. That's a bill, so that's one of the 250. So bills of consequence, they're few and far between. All right, but we digress. So let's talk about allowable uses, because that is by far the #1 question we get on CPA is allowable use questions. And CPA spending is divided into 2 categories. Administrative expenses for running the committee, and that's up to 5% of your annual take on CPA. And then the other 95% is for projects that you recommend to town meeting. So there's 2 categories there, and they're very different and they don't mix. The administrative account is just for the committee running itself, the expenses of running the committee. So, Beth's fee to help them out and do administrative work from the committee is the biggest one, staff to support the committee. Any other town have, Shrewsbury used to have someone, but not right now, right?
It was part of the role of an assistant planner.
Yeah.
Right now, we are staffed by the town planner, but there's talk of looking into administrative.
Hiring someone, yeah, great. Upton, you've never had anyone for administrative work, have you?
We have had.
You have?
Somebody who was an administrative assistant for other departments, including CPC.
Which is like Beth does, yeah.
Northbridge does.
Yes, Northbridge does, and Mendon, Ann does all the work, so, there you go. That's the #1 expense. But other things that you need, if you want to hire a consultant to help you review historic proposals to make sure they're, in keeping with the Secretary of Interior standards. If you need a housing consultant to look through the pro forma from a housing application and analyze the numbers. Any due diligence on projects is really fair game for the administrative account. It is not for any project expenses after the project's approved at town meeting. We get the question a lot, hey, costs came in higher than they anticipated. Can we use some of the administrative funds for the $5,000 they're short? You cannot do that. There's a firewall between those 2 accounts. One's for running the CPC, the other's for projects. During the due diligence phase, if you have to work on a project to get it ready for town meeting, that's fair game for the administrative fund. But once town meeting gives that project a budget, you can't then supplement it with more money from the administrative fund. And it's also not okay to use the administrative fund to pay any municipal staff other than your dedicated CPA administrator who works for the committee. So if the town planner does work on CPA, that's part of their job to be a town planner. It's one of the things they do. If the tax collector collects the local surcharge money, or the assessor assesses the local surcharge money, or processes the exemption applications, or if the town clerk puts your warrant articles on the warrant, or the town administrator works on, bidding for new soccer fields. That's just all part of their normal jobs. And so it's not an administrative account for the Community Preservation Act program. It's an administrative account for running your committee, not for the program as a whole. There is no CPA administrative account for running the program. I think the legislature knew that cash-strapped municipalities would find that a very tempting target to do all sorts of things. So that's the difference between the administrative fund and project expenses. One thing we get a lot of time is people ask about, the Historic Commission has come to us and they want to do a study of this. Can we use our administrative account? And I always say the number one tell on an idea not being okay for administrative funds is if someone else is asking you to do it. Because it's your administrative account, it's for your committee. If someone else is asking you, they're kind of asking to borrow or use your administrative account, they should have their own administrative account, right? So that's the number one way you see things that aren't okay, is when someone else outside of the CPC is asking you to use the money. That's right there a big tell. So anyone ever heard that term, tell? Have you heard that term before? I learned the greatest tell the other day. I had no idea. The number one way that college admissions counselors, because my son's applying for colleges this year, can tell that a parent has worked on their kid's essay?
2 spaces after the period.
Oh my God, Deborah! Ding, ding!
Yeah.
2 spaces. Did you all learn to put 2 spaces when you learned how to type on a typewriter? I still do it.
I still do too.
2 spaces.
Looks right.
How did you know that, Deborah?
Doesn't look right.
I was helping one of my daughters with an essay, and she said, I took periods, the spaces you added out. I added spaces? I had no idea I'd done it.
It's not possible to stop. Once you've been trained that way, it is not possible. And Chase, our communications director, just revealed to me about a year ago, he's been here for 8 years, that he has what's that, Glenn, you're a computer guy, right? What's that thing called when you set up a program that does something automatically? Algorithm.
It's a
or-
routine or something.
Yeah, routine or whatever, that everything I write and I send to Chase for the newsletter or the program, it immediately he puts it through the masher that takes out all my extra spaces. And he didn't tell me. He did this for 7 years and he
And
didn't tell me.
most software will do it for you.
Yeah,
anyways.
right.
He's saving them up.
They make it
When you
from right to
retire,
wrong.
he's gonna give them all.
Give me all those
Bag of
double
space.
spaces. That's great. Anyway, so that's where I learned the word tell. And that's our CPA tell, is when someone asks for administrative funds. Okay, so now let's go on to project funds. The CPA legislation famously says nothing about who can apply for funds. So we get everyone applying for funding, which is great. But some common themes have developed over the years. The two entities that most often apply for funding are the town itself, some board or committee in town that wants to do something on municipal land, and private entities, usually nonprofits in town, doing great community work. Those two are really the core of CPA. Now, it doesn't say that these other groups or entities couldn't apply for funding, but you need to be careful when it's not one of the two obvious ones. You even need to be careful on private entities. That's the next slide. So sometimes communities get applications from non-incorporated entities, the Friends of Johnson Park, the Friends of the Library, which is an active group and they want to do something on that asset in town, but they're not a 501c3. Well, your town has no way to cut them a check, right? There's payment rules in Massachusetts. They're very careful about who municipal public money goes to. It can't be cut to Sarah, who functions as the volunteer president of the Friends of Johnson Park, and she.
The quick question.
Yeah.
Those type of organizations don't have any legal authority.
That's
to
right.
work on a particular.
Well,
project.
that's another story.
Okay.
But they also could never even accept the money because the state procurement laws won't allow you to give money to an individual. So that's a big problem. Privately owned commercial historic buildings, we're seeing some good programs with that, but it has to be set up very carefully. The number one thing we might see is in urban areas where they have a downtown historic building facade improvement program where they're really fixing up the facades of all the beautiful historic buildings downtown because that really adds to the character of the historic downtown. Lowell is doing a lot with, and that involves some public grants of public money to a private organization to fix up their facade. But there's tremendous public benefit from that. And religious institutions were a huge part of CPA until Acton got sued. It's one of only 2 lawsuits in CPA that have ever gone all the way to the SJC. It was actually pretty cool to go to the SJC and hear the Supreme Justices asking questions of the lawyers about CPA and talking about CPA. I was sitting in the audience and I'm like, this is cool. The SJC is talking about CPA. But of course, it wasn't that cool because we had a CPA community getting sued over something. That was not good. Anyone familiar with the Acton church lawsuit case? You can read a lot about it on our website. It really called into question, it's complicated, so I won't get into it tonight, but it's called into the question of, are these organizations primarily using this money for religious purposes, or are they primarily using it to keep up a or to rehabilitate a historic asset that is like a treasure in the town, right? It's a tough, tough question. Any separation of church and state issues are really difficult. And so that's another one. The SJC it was a muddled decision. They didn't say you couldn't do it, but you definitely would want to get your town council involved every single time you get a religious institution application. We're seeing a lot of communities still doing these types of projects, but there's a right way and a wrong way, and you definitely want the town council to tell you it's okay, give the thumbs up, because then it's on them. So that's the proper way to do those. All right, so private projects. I don't think, reading through the law, it dawned on us, like 15 years in, I don't think the legislature ever considered that CPA would be used on anything but town assets. There's nothing in the law about the private organizations. It's silent, so it doesn't mean it's not allowed, but if they had really thought of that as a big part of CPA, they would have put in a bunch of checks and balances that complied with the state procurement laws and all sorts of ways you have to do that properly, and there's nothing in there. So I think they were very myopic just thinking about CPA that was going to go on town projects, but we've turned it into something much larger and much better for that, because community preservation is all about quality of life, and these are the organizations that are doing this kind of work on the ground in your communities. But there is actually an amendment to our state's constitution from 1850 called the Anti-Aid Amendment that says it's actually not allowed to give public money to a private organization. Now, it's been modified through SJC court decisions a bunch of times in the 150 years since it passed. And it now has been interpreted by the courts to mean you can't give public money to a private organization for their private purposes. But you can give public money to a private organization to fulfill a public purpose, right? So the example I give, it's not a good one, but I do it anyways. You're giving money to the Historic Society that runs a beautiful house museum that's open to the public all the time. There are events there and everything. And they want money to fix up their exterior front steps that are crumbling repair the entryway so it's easier for the public to get into the building, right? That seems like a pretty good project and one that CPA would fund. If they apply for the same amount of money, but it's to fix up the walls and the carpeting and the leaky ceiling in the director's office of the nonprofit, well, how does that benefit the public, right? That's just really saving the nonprofit the money of doing that. It's really a private purpose. So that's not a great example, but it gives you the idea of the difference between money. It's the same amount of money going to the same organization, but one fulfills a public purpose and one does not. So this is something to be aware of. Anytime you get a private project, you want to have a conversation at your CPC. What is the public benefit of this grant? And does the public benefit, is it worthy enough of public benefit, or is the private benefit, primary? Because that would be a red flag. Sometimes there isn't an obvious public benefit. We've had CPA money given to historic buildings that are closed to the public. But it's usually for exterior work, and it's visible from the public way, and it contributes, it's in the historic district, and it's a dilapidated building, and it's bringing down, the historic district. And so, the public doesn't even get to go in that building, it's privately owned, but fixing up the facade is a public purpose. And usually, when you're giving money to a nonprofit, if it's for a building work on a building that the town doesn't control, getting a preservation restriction back in return is the number one way you can guarantee public benefit. Because a preservation restriction given to the town is actually an ownership interest in the building. You own a piece of that building, and you get a say in what happens to that building in the future to keep it looking beautiful and historic and keep it from being torn down. So it's important to really discuss this at your meeting. How are we getting the public benefit and ensuring that the public benefit will continue into the future? And often a preservation restriction can be a really solid way to do that. All right. So now into the meat of the program here on allowable uses. Anyone recognize this chart? This is the single most important piece of paper in the CPA universe, for sure. It's the allowable uses chart. This is the modified simple version of the chart. There is an official version from the Department of Revenue that we have on our website. The only difference is it has definitions around the edges here of all these different words. Most laws start with a definitions section. I'd love for you to all read CPA. It's 17 pages. Don't do it late at night, but it's a good take. But if you only want to read the most important part of CPA, read section 2 right at the beginning. The definitions are where the rubber meets the road of any law. And in CPA, it's those definitions for the words acquire through rehabilitate, and the definition of what it means to be open space, housing, historic, etc. And DOR did this chart in 2005, I think. And this basically is a visual representation of section 5B2 of chapter 44B, which is our law. And 5B2 is a paragraph that only a lawyer could love. It is so convoluted. It tells you what you can do with your CPA money. It's like the heart of the whole law, 5B2. But boy, you can read that thing, and for the first 5 years of CPA, when I was chair of my committee, we had no idea what we were doing or what we could use our CPA money for. And then this chart came out, and it was like picture tells 1,000 words. All of a sudden, it made a lot more sense of what we could do with our funding. So here's how you use this chart. Obviously, everyone knows the 4 categories of CPA, right? But what folks don't realize is you can't fund everything in those categories. Far from it. You can only fund projects in those 4 categories that can be described by one of the verbs on the left side of this chart. And not all verbs lead to a successful box underneath that category, right? For example, you can't create something historic.
Yeah, that's like, how can you create an historic building?
The legislature was absolutely brilliant. They got that right. We applaud them for that. They put a no in that column. So it's really important when you get an application to look at this chart. We're encouraging communities to put this chart in their application materials and force the applicant to think about what box on this chart justifies our request. Make them do the work. It'll cut down on a lot of applications where people ask for things and it sounds good. It's in those 4 categories. It sounds like a CPA project, but can you show me where it lives on the chart? And you can't. Unless you can take the expenses of that project and stuff them in one of these boxes that works, it's not eligible for funding. Glenn?
So support is a difficult one. Can you give us some examples of what supporting, request for supporting open space or historic or recreation?
Yep.
The no's.
Right. So everyone has always asked about the support, right? Support actually didn't have a definition in CPA until we encouraged the legislature to put one in. And they put one in that really only applies to housing. We now have a better definition of what support is for housing, but we still don't have a really great definition of support for these other 3 categories. The easiest way to understand it is if, let's say in the historic, if you're not acquiring something, buying a building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact. Those are the 6 things that you can deal with in CPA. If you're not buying one of those 6 things, preserving one of those 6 things, meaning protecting it from injury, harm, or destruction, or rehabilitating one of them, bringing it back to its former glory. If you're not doing one of those three things, it's probably support. Everything else. So I'm going to give 2 examples tonight of one project next that is successfully found a box on the chart, and then I'm going to give an example of a project that ends up in support in the historic category, and you'll see that it's not eligible. But it's any activities that help that category, but aren't one of these verbs.
How about open space? What would be supporting open space?
Oh, the Conscom wants to hire a wildlife biologist to go out to all the open space in town and determine if the emerald ash borer has taken over the ash trees in town. You're not buying a piece of open space. You're not creating a piece of open space. There's really, the create box for open space and recreation really is not used. In the other SJC case was a case of Newton and recreation. It led to the change in the law that allows us to do recreation projects now. But one of the justices was peppering the lawyer with questions, and he asked the lawyer, he said, what does this create, in recreation and open space? What does that mean? And the example that the lawyer gave was, well, creating open space and recreation is if you have wetlands and you fill them in to build this is what the lawyer said to the SJ, and the SJC, the justices are nodding their head like this. I'm like burying my head in the sand. What was your original question?
No, I was asking, open space support. I mean.
Oh, yeah. So I gave you
talked
that.
about the emerald ash borer.
Right. I gave
But
you that
that would
example.
be preserving the open space.
Preserving is protection of the asset from injury, harm, or destruction. And it has to be a capital improvement. That's a really hard litmus test to reach on conservation. I suppose if you had done all the work to determine that there was emerald ash borer and there was some capital expense that you could do, like spraying would be a maintenance expense. I can't think of one to fit my emerald ash borer example. But, hiring an administrative assistant to go through all the files and create better land files for the Conscom of all the land they bought with CPA funding. That's like an administrative expense. The legislature knew that if they opened up, there's very little money to support your Conscom, your recreation committee, your historic commission. Does anyone on the historic commission here? Do you have a budget given to you by town meeting?
Just recently.
I think it just
How much?
was reinstated.
How much was the?
20,000 in Upton.
Really?
Yeah.
That's unbelievable.
We asked the town for it.
But you've traditionally not had one.
No.
And Paul, you were laughing?
Very small. What
Like
did they raise?
$400.
Yeah,
400 bucks.
yeah. I'm on the land committee in my town. We get,
Don't spend it all on one
that's
place.
right, we get $500. Most historic commissions have no budget. Although Cambridge has 5 full-time employees in their historic department, which is incredible. So the legislature knew that these are not, rich areas of the town. And they usually don't get money in the town budget, which is why CPA came about, is these are things that don't fit in the town budget. But they knew if they carved that out, communities would be all over that. And they would be raiding the hen house to cover expenses that just are really hard for towns to do. So the reason why they allowed it in the housing category, and frankly, the only reason it's even on this chart is so they could do it in the housing category, so you had to put a no in the other boxes. But the reason they did it was housing, because housing is the toughest category. It takes years, it takes a ton of money, it's politically charged, it's red tape filled. You could go 5 years just doing soft costs and getting permitting and design and community meetings and architects and engineering and all that before you put a shovel in the ground. So they knew they wanted to give as many tools in the toolbox in the housing category. You can see there are more yeses in that box, in that category, than anyone else. Yeah.
I was going to say, and you mentioned all the reasons it's difficult, and still the other reasons is because you're often dealing with private entities when it comes to housing.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask, and I think this might answer one of your questions as well, a better description between preserve and rehabilitate when it comes to houses. Because I'm on the housing authority, not the Affordable Housing Trust.
Okay.
Adjacent to that, if CPC wanted to give us money, we'd love it, but the state gives us all we get.
Right.
So it would be, at this point, not eligible. We said, hey, we have a building that, like, siding on one side's coming down. Could we get money for that? Like, well, no, because the CPC is just fixing the siding of this complex.
Right.
But if we were building a complex and said, we want to put on this special siding that won't be damaged for 50 years, you could say, well, that's preserving.
Yeah.
So then the only issue just becomes almost like timing.
Yeah.
Like, we didn't ask for this soon enough.
So this is a bit of a complicated issue, which if we have time at the end, I'd like to dig into it a little bit. But that special siding would not be in the preserve box. Preserve is protect the asset from injury, harm, or destruction. All those expenses to build new housing would all be in the creation box. Everything, any expense that you can think of to build affordable housing would be in the create box because it's all leading to the creation of a new unit of affordable housing. But what you're asking about is a sticky wicket with CPA. It's rehabilitation and preservation of existing affordable housing units. So I'll come back to that if that's okay. So, yeah.
Can you explain the no under housing? Like, what would be an example of that?
The bottom one?
Yeah,
The-
rehabilitate housing and it's no.
Right. So
Less.
this is exactly what
Oh, okay.
what I forget her name.
Jack.
Jack. Jack. This is exactly what Jack's asking about, is rehabilitation would be fixing up existing affordable housing units.
Okay.
So new kitchens, upgraded windows, new carpeting, storm doors. I mean, we have 40,000 units of affordable housing in Massachusetts, of public affordable housing. It's all in terrible shape. There is a $7 billion backlog of repairs, and they're all state units. They may be in your town, and they may be run by your local housing authority, but they're state-owned units, and your housing authority is a state agency. And the state's responsible for those, and they've done a terrible job until that bill I talked about that passed at the last minute, the Affordable Homes Act on July 31st, has $2 billion of money for rehabilitation of existing affordable housing units.
So if we have some units like that in Mendon, there's only 30. And so if we were created, like in that same space, we created 30 more,
That's good.
that's okay.
Yeah, that doesn't matter. And
But you might have to, I'll call you sometime if we ever get to that.
you might have to tear down the other ones. Yeah, and who's doing that right now? Is it Belmont? I think Belmont is tearing down 60 units of dilapidated old.
It happens more often than you think.
Yeah, but they're replacing it with like 140 units because they can be much more efficient in their use of the land now.
Was that created, or that no, with that exception, created to encourage, CPA money for creation?
Yes.
Housing? So
Exactly.
that's the carrot.
The legislature, we're actually getting into this whole conversation now, that's okay. The legislature created CPA to address the number one issue, which was we need more housing units. We're 200,000 units short of what we need in Massachusetts to keep everyone here. And so CPA was for the creation of new affordable housing units. I think they knew there was a $7 billion backlog, but they also knew those were state units and that has always been paid out of the state budget and they needed to do a better job. It took them 20 years to figure it out. And $2 billion is not $7 billion, so it's still a long way from what the need is. But CPA is still a pretty modest funding source. It can't, as you were saying, it can't do everything. And so if we were trying to serve all masters, fix up our housing authorities, put new kitchens in, build new units, there's not enough money in CPA for even 1/4 of that. So they really wanted to focus on creation, and that's why they put that no in there. And by the way, we have never had a unit of CPA housing built, because CPA is so new, that needed rehabilitation.
But my other question is, just to John's point, is that the cost of it, you can do different things to help and support housing. I don't think you're gonna be able to really be able to build based on costs.
CPA can never fund 100% of a housing development,
Yeah.
but it can make critical investments in it and leverage other funding. That's the way it works. And the biggest value of CPA in the housing category is being the first money into a project, to meeting with a developer who's got an idea, and you're the first one to give him money, because it's so much easier for a CPC in town meeting to give money to kickstart something than it is to go get federal tax credits or low-income housing credits, or to get in line at the state, which takes 2 to 3 years to get funding from DHCD. So that initial money is critical. I went to a groundbreaking, it was a long time ago, in North Andover. They had an abandoned, closed former nursing home right downtown, empty for years. And a developer came to them and said, I want to turn that into permanent affordable housing. Perfect use of that building. And the North Andover CPC said, we love that idea, you know, and they asked him, how much do you need to do all the feasibility studies and apply for other funding? And he said, $400,000. They gave it to him. And then like 3 years later, or 2 years later, I went to the grand opening of that project. And all the state officials were there, you know, all patting themselves on the back. And they handed out a sheet that listed all the money and all the different funding sources that had to go into that housing project. There were like 15 different programs, federal programs, state programs, nonprofit things. And CPA was just buried on the list, 400,000. It was like one of the lower contributions. You know, the state low-income tax credit program gave 6 million, you know, whatever. But everyone at the meeting all talked about the 400,000 that kickstarted it, and the positive vote of town meeting saying we want this in our town. That told everyone else that this was going to happen. So that's the critical part that CPA can play.
Would that seed money qualify as acquiring or creating?
Creating, yes.
So that seed
Yeah.
money,
In the housing category, the creation is basically the first 5 years of any project. All those tasks, they're
Okay.
all leading to creation.
and you only
So-
have to do one of those tasks to get it to be created.
Well, CPA can only pay for the cost of that task.
Right.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, but then that, under that no, that unit or units becomes a yes. So if you've done seed money, you helped to create it.
Oh, then
Now,
later,
in the
If
future.
North
Yes,
Andover
yes.
came and wanted money for rehabbing that, could they use CPA money?
now they could because they put money in.
Okay.
But what
But
I'm
it's
saying
not an
is,
all or nothing thing.
right, but what I'm saying is that's never ever happened in the history of CPA. Because all our
Because,
affordable
yeah.
housing is less than 20 years old, and most of it's like less than 10 or 15 years old,
Yeah.
because it took a while to get going. So they don't need, actually, I just heard about the first ever project that I could think of where something built with CPA 20 years ago is going to need a new septic system. And they were asking whether CPA could do that, and they probably could. They're rehabilitating the septic system, and they built it with CPA funds. To answer, I think what your question is, because I get this sometimes, is, you know, is there a threshold? Do you have to fund half the project?
Right.
Or can
What-
you
what-
put $1 in, and $1 of CPA, just to preserve the right to 25 years later fix it up? You probably could do that, because CPA has no
But then
rules.
then it would probably get legislated out. It'd probably be an amendment.
It would definitely
But
be
if you
an-
do a good faith effort
Right.
of a, not substantial, but a critical, I'll call it a critical
Yeah.
funding, then, okay.
The law does not, the thing about CPA is, Section 17 of CPA gives the Department of Revenue the authority to write regulations. Normally, the way state laws happen is, the legislature passes the law, and it's just the bones. And then a state agency spends a year or two with public hearings and lawyers and everything, and they write 700 pages of regulations. Anyone familiar with 40B?
Oh, yeah.
The 40B law is like 1 page long. It's like simple and nothing. The regulations are, I don't know, I'm making it up, but 700
It's not
pages.
even regulations, it's guidelines.
They never even get to the
I
regulatory?
don't think so.
Oh, that's
I mean,
interesting.
I just haven't looked at it in a long
Yeah,
time.
DOR, what she's referring to is DOR has these different levels of official, you know, there's regulations, which are official, then there's guidelines, which are quasi-official, and then there's
It's the level.
bulletins.
It's the level of enforcement and whether you have to go for a variance or a
Right.
waiver or, so it's, yeah.
Right. But the Department of Revenue never wrote regulations on CPA. So if they had, that question would have been answered in regulations. It would say, as long as CPA funded at least 5% of an affordable housing complex, then you could use it to
Right.
rehabilitate later, but that
There
level
was
of
some
detail is
differences.
just not in CPA. Yeah, Ann?
Can CPA funds be used to subsidize a project, an affordable housing project?
Subsidize, I mean, bring down the cost of the units? Absolutely. Yeah, we call those buy downs.
Or not even the units, but like we're working on selling some property to a developer to make affordable housing. So there's
Okay.
a lot of work we're trying to prepare ahead of time so that they're saving money. But still, it's just people don't, make money on affordable housing, and that's why they need the state grants and all that. Can you use the CPA funds to subsidize a developer that's gonna make affordable housing?
Absolutely, yeah. The only thing you have to worry about, you don't really have to, determine, if he's asking for 250 on a $12 million budget, you don't really have to determine if the 250,000 he's asking for is gonna buy nails, or is it gonna dig the septic system, or is it gonna do drywall? You don't have to worry about that. What you have to worry about is how many units are gonna be affordable, and does the amount of money you're giving justify that number of units? So the average cost of an affordable unit in Massachusetts could be, let's say it's $250,000. If you're gonna get one affordable unit, you could give him 250. If he was asking for $1 million, and he was only gonna do one affordable unit, well, you're now subsidizing the market rate units that are gonna be in there. So as long as there's an equality to the money you're giving and the value of the affordable units that are gonna result, you absolutely can just give them the money, with a grant agreement, and they have to sign and a contract and everything. Ken?
Stuart, in that case, how is the affordability guaranteed for the future?
An affordable housing restriction. So the only way, CPA only requires restrictions when you acquire something, when you buy it, right? You can put restrictions on in other cases. So CPA doesn't really explicitly guarantee that you're going to get an affordable housing restriction. But every developer needs more money than just CPA. And any other program they go to for the rest of the money requires the restrictions that are approved by the state. And
Let's go with the deed.
they go with the deed, and they're held by the town that the units are in.
And how are they enforced in the future?
Well, that's an interesting question, and there are 351 answers to that question. Some towns have a person who's compliance and monitoring of affordable units, who's constantly reviewing everything happening with the existing affordable units, scanning the registry for ones that are going on sale to make sure that they're being sold to an affordable, handing those transfer. Other towns own affordable housing restrictions and don't even know they own the restrictions. So it's a mixed bag. Our town is very small, and we only have 13 affordable units, and someone wasn't minding the store, and we lost one. It went and was sold for market rate, and we lost it.
Are there consulting organizations that
Absolutely.
can be paid to do that
And,
enforcement?
yep, absolutely, tons of them.
How does the 40B process work? I've only been involved in projects, I've never been involved in second, third generation buyers.
Right.
Because they have all the requirements and the maximum you
Right.
can increase.
That's
on.
probably a question above my
Okay.
head.
But I would think
honestly.
that would be a good model.
Well, a high percentage of CPA projects are 40Bs, because that's how
Right.
they end up getting permitted. The other thing I was going to say, Ken, is not only will the restrictions come because all the other programs require them, towns and developers usually want the unit to count on your subsidized housing inventory. Is everyone familiar with the SHI, the 10% requirement in
Yeah.
Massachusetts? The only way you get toward that 10% that the state tells you have to have is to be on this official list the state keeps. And the official list is made off of the restrictions. Like when the
Right.
restriction gets written, you get credit for a
It's got to
unit.
be on the deed, though.
What's that?
It has to be on the deed.
Well, I'm saying the restriction is recorded with the deed, so same
Correct.
thing, yeah. But a deed can be a market rate deed, and it can be where you're not going to get on this SHI, and it can be affordable deed.
Correct.
So usually there's a regulatory agreement or a restriction filed with the deed that,
I'm just saying, you lost one unit, go after the attorney.
what's that?
Go after the attorney, or whoever did the title.
Yeah, yeah. That was a long time ago. We've learned our lesson. and,
Yeah.
Just before you move
Yep.
on, under recreation.
Yep.
And clarification, they did change the law because didn't that used to be no unless acquired?
Right, so,
The reasoning, the rationale was you can't create new parkland in Cambridge, so there was no way for them to use any of this money for recreation because there was no land.
right, yep. Oh, wow.
Oh, that's, you got a marker.
Yeah, look at that, cool.
You
All
can
right.
use a pen.
Yeah, I didn't mean to touch the screen, actually, I was just kind of pointing to that. But that yes box there is the one John was asking about. That actually, when CPA was first passed, this bottom row all said this. They all said, no, you couldn't do any rehabilitation on existing assets. And that was a response to Prop 2.5. Anyone remember the name Barbara Anderson? Citizens for Limited Taxation? Barbara was a one-woman force that got Prop 2.5 passed in Massachusetts. Her organization was really powerful in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. She passed away a few years ago. She was from Marblehead. And she got Prop 2.5 passed. And then she heard about this CPA idea that was going to be 3% more for municipalities, and she went ballistic. She was like, over my dead body, are we passing a law that's going to have 3% for this community preservation stuff on top of my 2.5? And so there was a grand bargain reached with her that took a decade. And the bargain was, we'll prohibit the towns from spending their CPA money on stuff they already own. CPA will be for new stuff, but anything they already own has to be covered out of the Prop 2.5 budget. So that's how that came about. Now, the first domino to fall, and they got CPA done finally, and everyone was mollified. The first domino to fall was the historic category, right? Bedford, in 2001, a year after CPA's passed, they apply for $1 million to fix up their historic town hall, and town council says, I can't let you do that. Because in 1857, you did not build town hall with CPA funds. And the law says you can only rehabilitate it if you acquired or created it with CPA funds. I can't let you do it. And everyone said, what do you mean? That's what CPA is for, is restoring historic buildings. And so the legislature immediately responds, and if you know anything about, sometimes bills take a long time, in like 5 minutes, the law had been changed and a yes had been put in that box. Now, I was not around then. I do not understand how that happened. How could a major law have passed like this with that kind of error in it, right? So here's what I think happened. It dawned on me. I think the fix was in. I think in a private backroom meeting, anyone watch Hamilton? The room where it happened, right? In the room where it happened, where that CPA bill happened, someone said, how are we going to get around Barbara? And they said, all right, let's just give her what she wants, no existing assets. After we pass the law, we'll go back and fix the historic category immediately. So I think the fix was in. I think they passed it knowing it had a fatal error in it that they were just going to fix. I've made that story up. I have no idea if it's true, but it sure sounds to me like it's true. The next one to go was what John was asking about. So in 2007, you remember I said there have been 2 lawsuits at the SJC that have gone all the way to the SJC? The first was Newton was sued because they tried to fix up or rehabilitate Stearns and Pellegrini Park in 2007. And citizens sued and said you can't fix up Stearns and Pellegrini Parks because they weren't built with CPA funds. And Newton said, no, we're calling it creation. We're creating a new basketball court in the park and a new sitting area and new lighting and new walkways. And the plaintiffs said, no, that's rehabilitating Stearns and Pellegrini Park. Creation would be filling in wetlands to build a new park on top of it. That's what creation would be. You're not creating anything new. Now, their example was ridiculous, but they were right. The plaintiffs were right in this case. Creation with CPA means you look down at the land and what you have there now is not recreational. And when you're done doing what you're going to do with CPA funds, it's a recreational piece of land. It's a park, right? So if you're doing new things, if you're creating new things within the 4 walls of the existing park, you're not creating any new parkland. You're just fixing it up. You're rehabilitating it. So, so Newton lost that lawsuit because they claimed it was creation. It wasn't. and they lost. I remember being on the phone with the mayor at the time when he lost the lower court decision and he wanted to appeal. And he and all the CPA people called me and we were on a big conference call together, and I said, please don't appeal, because if you appeal and it goes to the SJC, the decision is now binding on the other 100 CPA communities at the time. So lick your wounds, you lost, you can't do Stearns and Pellegrini, but please don't make a problem for all the other CPA communities. But he really wanted to appeal, and it went right to the SJC, and they lost. So then Newton came and said, we need to change the law. And they were right about that too, because before that, the only thing you could do in the recreation category was buy new land for fields and parks, create new ones by filling in wetlands, and preserving them, protecting them from injury, harm, or destruction, which is, maybe fixing some drainage, to keep it from flooding, or a retaining wall where there's landslides. There's really not much going on. And so we had the data to show this category was broken. Nothing was happening in this category. Who's going to go buy new land for, $500,000 an acre to build soccer fields when you have 10 existing deplorable soccer fields that have had no investment because you don't have any money to fix them up? Why are you going to go build new ones and leave these 10? That's not very green, right? So we had the data to show nothing was happening in the historic category. And this is really what was necessary in Massachusetts, was money to rehabilitate. And so it took us 5 years to convince the legislature, because they had long memories. And they said, didn't you guys promise that CPA was not going to fix up existing assets? They remembered, we're like, yeah, we did, but now we have the data to show you that is not working in the recreation category. So 5 years, we finally convinced them, and they made that change. And all they did to make that change is take out no unless acquired or created and put a yes in there. And that's how we ended up with a yes there. Now that begs the question, someone's going to ask it, what about the open space? Open space in CPA, by the way, means conservation land. Recreation is parks, playgrounds, athletic fields, trails. This is conservation land. What about that category and housing? I don't think those will ever happen, because they don't make the sense that the historic one and the recreation one. With conservation land, you really don't want to give a big budget to municipalities to go mucking around on their conservation land. That's designed to sit there and be great for passive recreation and wildlife and biodiversity and carbon sinking and all that other great things, water filtering, that our conservation land does. So that is too tempting. I don't think they'll ever open that up. And with housing, as soon as you let communities willy-nilly spend all their money on fixing up housing authority units, as important as that is, creation is dead. It's so much easier for a town to, go fix up and put, new kitchens in their housing authorities, because they are deplorable, rather than building new housing, because that's so hard. So that's why I don't think those two will ever get changed. So that's why I was really glad to see the state put $2 billion into their housing authority units. I mean, they do put money in, but it's not even scratching the surface so far.
So for recreation, and you just said trails is a recreational allowable expense.
Yep.
What's the distinction between a trail and a sidewalk?
Okay. Another lawsuit with CPA. You know what? We've had so few. I hate that we're talking about all these lawsuits, but Norwell was sued over doing sidewalks. And they claimed, no, this is a recreational path. They called it a path walk. They made up a new name, a path walk, the Norwell path walk. And they said, no, this is for recreation. But the issue was that it was within the transportation right of way. It was alongside the road. And there's, the town owns a right of way. In Massachusetts, we often call that stone wall to stone wall. From the old farmer stone wall on one side.
Two Wad Road.
Yeah.
33 feet.
Yep. I lost my train of thought there. So theirs was just a sidewalk along the road. So as soon as the road needed to be widened, that sidewalk was going to be gone, And what the judge said also is, we acknowledge that sidewalks are used for recreation, right? But the primary purpose of a sidewalk is for transportation, to get from point A to point B. That's the main use of sidewalks. The secondary benefit of recreation is important, but it's not the main use of sidewalks, and CPA is for recreation. So that was the issue there. A big part of a debate in CPA, we're just about to put an article on our website with some technical assistance, is communities are sometimes making the mistake of what is actually recreational land, right? So the library applies to put new benches and a walkway on the lawn in front of the library, you know? It looks like a park, but as you look at the earth, it's general municipal land. It's a library, it's got a building on it, right? That's not a park. Parks are under control of the Parks Commission or whatever board does parks, and they have legal protection under Article 97 of our state's constitution to be protected as parkland. So CPA is for protected parkland. So trails through the woods are on protected either conservation land or recreation land. That's okay. A sidewalk along the road is not on recreational land, it's on general municipal transportation corridor
I'm
land.
thinking maybe Lincoln is a good example. Like, they have sidewalks that are windy, and they're probably 10 or 15 feet.
Off the
They're
road?
not in the right of way, so they're set back, they're attractive, they're safer, and they're kind of curvy. It's not
Okay.
like it's a straight shot.
Those may be okay. Who owns that land, and for what purpose was that land
Most of
acquired?
that's undeveloped land that you see those on.
But
so-
someone has to own that land.
Right.
And if it's the municipality, you go back to the town meeting vote when they got that land. And if it said for general municipal purposes, or for the road corridor, or for transportation purposes or whatever, that wouldn't be okay. But if there was that, is it 33 feet, stone wall,
Yeah,
stone wall?
that's- yeah,
If there was that 33 feet of transportation corridor, and then they bought that land, and they bought it for park purposes or recreation purposes, then that would be okay. And actually, you might find an example of where a sidewalk right along the road, but it's actually on dedicated recreation land, that would actually be okay. Because if you have a park and you have 4 walls of a park, and you want to put walkways through that park, that's fine, because it's on the dedicated recreation land. But if you want to put walkways around all 4 squares of it on the outside of the park, in the transportation corridor, that's not the park, that's not recreation land.
Are you also saying that, you know, for it to be quote, open space, it has to be Article 97?
Open space meaning conservation land or
Yeah.
recreation? Actually, both.
Both?
Yeah, yes, yes.
You do realize a lot of recreation land is not Article 97?
Article 97 is one of the ways to do it.
Okay.
There's other ways to do it. If it was acquired in the deed for recreational purposes or park purposes, that would be fine.
Yep,
If it was under control of the Board of Park Commissioners,
okay.
that would be
All right,
fine.
That's, all right.
But those two things are actually also covered by Article 97.
It's
So
not as clear.
it's not as clear, right? We
It
don't,
is.
we have very few pieces of land that have been acquired for Article 97 purposes or under
Correct.
Article 97.
In
It-
Grafton, the Conservation Commission tried to identify all the Article 97 parcels. We had a very hard time.
Yeah, it's hard. You've got to dig, you've got to go back to the town meeting vote. And if there's not a town meeting vote, you got to examine the deed. I've examined handwritten deeds from the 1800. You've got to, maybe you got to look at the presentation that was made and what promises were said at town meeting verbally. You've got to look at what's in the town files that from 50 years ago that might be lost and see what it says in there. You've got
That's
to,
exactly
you got to
what
look
the
through
issue
all the
was.
town meeting
Yeah.
warrants to see if it was ever transferred, if a town meeting in 1910 transferred control of the old Johnson School lot to the Parks Department for use as a park. You know, it was a 1910 vote, boom, Article 97 protected conservation
Yeah.
land. But you got to go back, find that obscure town meeting
Yes.
vote. So it's really hard. If it's under control of the conscom, you can be pretty sure that's
Yeah,
okay for.
That part of it is usually fairly straightforward. It's-
Right.
And recent acquisitions are straightforward. It is definitely more the recreation parkland, depending upon
Right.
how it was acquired
Yep.
and a lot of other things.
It's hard. I mean, it really wouldn't matter a ton for CPA, which your conservation land,
okay.
because you can't do too much on
Right.
conservation land with CPA. So what would matter more is whether CPA acquired it or not. Part of the acquisition. But all right, so let's move on. Any other questions on this chart? So I want to give you 2 examples. And we have to be mindful of the time. So what time do we need to be wrapped up? Folks got another 30 minutes, you think? Yeah? Okay. I had one more slide first. So when you get this chart and then you get an application, how do you use the chart? Well, the first thing is you must make sure there's a budget with every application. If I can stress one thing tonight, is make sure your applications come with a budget for the project. It's not going to be perfect because it hasn't gone out to bid yet, right? But you've got to know what the CPA money is to be spent on. People make the mistake all the time of describing the project. We're going to fix up Johnson Park. Well, what does that mean? You don't care about that. What you care about is what is the CPA dollar going to be spent on? And that's the use that you have to make sure is on that chart. So you get the project budget, and then you go line item by line item in the budget, and you find the box on the chart that justifies that expense. What box? And if you can't find a box on that chart to stuff that line item in, it's not eligible for CPA funding. So, for example, you're going to do a historic building, rehab it top to bottom, $2 million. That's a great CPA project, right? That's what CPA is for. You go line item by line item, and you find an item, on page 7, that's new furniture for all the conference rooms. Well, furniture can be carried out of the building and used elsewhere. It's not part of a historic rehab. It's furniture. That's not eligible for CPA funding. Or you'll find, 4 flat screen TVs, for informational displays in the hallways. Well, hanging a TV on a wall, that's not historic rehabilitation, right? So you got to find a box. And you want to avoid what we call around the office verb shopping, which is the way to use this chart is you find the box that best describes the project. And unfortunately, you have to live with what it says in that box. So if you're putting a new kitchen in a housing authority unit, and you read the definition of rehabilitation in what section was that with the definitions in it? Do you remember? 2, very good. You read the definition of rehabilitation, well, a new kitchen is rehabilitation. But it actually could be called support of affordable housing too. Support doesn't even have a real clear definition. Anything is support. So let's call it support. Well, that's verb shopping, right? The way statutory construction works, and I did get taught by a lawyer actually. I thought it was the coolest. Statutory construction is why would the legislature have gone on of their way in the statute to make it not okay to do rehab if you could just go elsewhere in the statute and find somewhere to justify it, right? So you can't go verb shopping. You have to get in the box that best describes the project, not the one that it could describe a piece of it, and live with what it says in that box. All right, so now let's give an example. Let's say the select board applies to fix up a town historic building, new facade, new boiler, okay? All right, so the first thing you want to look at is that asset eligible for funding? So in the historic category, in section 2, the definition of a historic resource in CPA is a building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact. It has to be one of those 6 things. If it's not one of those 6 things, not eligible for funding. And not only that, those 6 things have to either be listed on the State Register of Historic Places, or your local historic commission has to have a hearing, not a public hearing, just a meeting, and declare it significant for the town in their history. Yeah?
What's the difference between a building and a real property?
Real property would be the Battle of Gettysburg was on a big open field that is preserved now because it was the site of the Battle of Gettysburg. It's land that doesn't have any structures on it, but that is hugely historic significance.
Cemetery, just
I think that could probably qualify. That's interesting. I never thought about that, but yeah. Yep. So something really historic happened. Salem has Gallows Hill, where it's basically just the side of a road, an embankment, that leads up to a hill where everything's built, but that is where everyone trudged up the hill, in the Salem witch trials, and they've carved out a little piece of the hill and built a little memorial and a little park there, that's real property.
It's interesting in my head, building and property have always been a synonym, but you're right, property doesn't have to be a
Right.
building, it can just be a lot.
That's right. Property that has a building on it is called, is usually, the property's been improved. When they say improved, that means it's had a building on it. All right, so let's assume that this building, it's definitely a building, and let's assume it's on the state register already. So that's great. So they've passed step 1. Now you go to the chart. Now you have to look at the budget and find a box on the allowable uses chart. So are you acquiring a building structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact? No, you already own it. Are you preserving it, protecting it from injury, harm, or destruction? That's usually like sprinkler systems or new siding to keep the water from infiltrating it. Really, it's rehabilitation. That's what those two tasks are, the new boiler and what did I say, facade? Yeah, facade might be preservation too. Probably should use a better example that's solidly rehabilitation there. So you've got good verbs on the chart. And so a lot of folks end the discussion there. It's eligible for funding. But that's the beginning of the discussion. The CPC's job is to determine, okay, it's eligible, great. Now, does it make sense? Do we want to recommend this? Is it something that we've identified in our CPA plan? Hopefully you all have a CPA plan, it's required by the law. Is this something we've talked about in our plan that's essential for the town that we uncovered as a need in the past? We've got $3 million in applications and we've only got $1.5 million to give out this year. How does this compare priority-wise to all the other applications? We just talked to the applicant and there are 16 things we asked them and they had no idea of the answer. This project is it's a great idea. It is not ready for prime time. You know what town meeting's like, right? You get up there with something that's half-baked, you're going to get your head handed to you probably, and that's going to hurt the credibility of the CPA program. If the CPC has recommended this and put their stamp of approval on it, and it's like a piece of Swiss cheese, that's not going to be good for your credibility at the next town meeting when you recommend something. So a lot of CPCs want to see that the applicant's doing hard work to try to raise other money too, that they're not just coming to CPA because that's easy. Especially if it's a private organization, you want to see them have the bake sales, and the capital campaign and that sort of thing. Public money is easy to just give out public money, but there's not a lot of it. So, that would be another thing that the CPC, there's a lot of factors that the CPC would consider. How much money have we given to this applicant before? Maybe they've gotten too much, compared to some of the other assets who have been a little shy about asking. So the job of the CPC is not just to recommend a project because it's eligible. It's much, much more than that. All right, so now let's give an example of a project that ends up not being eligible. Let's say you get an application for doing an oral history of World War II veterans. Thanks. In town. There's only 7 left. We want to capture their story. For $20,000, we're going to hire a video production company. They're going to interview these World War II veterans, make it into a 30-minute TV show. It's going to be on Grafton Cable Television. It's going to be part of the 3rd grade curriculum, and it's going to be played on a loop at the library. Okay? Great project. Super project. It's in the historic category, obviously. Are you acquiring a building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact? Nope. Are you preserving one or rehabilitating one? Nope. Not eligible for funding. And Glenn, this is where we come back to your support. That's really a project, it's in the historic preservation category, and there are tons of great projects, but CPA can't fund everything, right? And so that's an example of support. Some people might call it create because you're creating a new video, but
A big hole in that we have found is that for the town clerk, we're paying to have the Old Town records conserved.
yeah, that's a tough one.
And they're preserving them, so that's not the problem. They also wanted to digitize and have a CD.
Right.
So we can't make that.
Yeah, that's
because
support.
That's
You're creating a new format.
we
Yeah.
can't do that.
Yeah.
And even though you're not gonna touch the old one, so you're gonna preserve the old one by having people use the new technology.
Right.
But it's not allowed.
Some towns will even turn down the town clerk completely because of the no supplanting part of CPA. So another one of the Barbara Anderson built-in things, the little, what do they call those? Easter eggs, when they, seed something with little clues and little things. I call it the Barbara Anderson Easter egg in CPA is the last line of section 6, the no supplanting phrase. Basically, what it says is, and this goes back to Prop 2.5, if this is an expense that the town is responsible for, from other state laws or other regulations, or has always been paid out of the budget every year, it's got to stay in the budget. CPA can't supplant town spending on something that's the general responsibility. So some CPCs will look at that and say, the town clerk has a gigantic state law called the Records Retention Law that describes all the things they have to do according to state law. They've been doing it for 200 years. The town's responsible for paying that. So that's the way some look at it. It's a gray area. That's a good gray area of CPA. Some do it, and some feel that it's really supplanting. It probably goes to the nature of what the documents are. You know, if the town clerk is asking to preserve, you know, all the meeting minutes from the Board of Selectmen going back 200 years, you know, or the sewer records for the sewer department going back 200 years, that sounds like more of a general administrative bookkeeping responsibility that the town has to do. If they're asking to restore all these documents in the vault from the 1600s, you know, that were in the basement of the church when it used to be town hall, and are, you know, like Bill Ricca restored the original deed from the Native Americans to the town to buy that land. It was unbelievable. It's beautiful. It's like a big, huge document with all sorts of colors. Great historic document in the vault, in the town clerk's vault. And they restored it. They sent it to a conservator who spent a ton of money, and it is beautiful. We wrote a whole article on it, actually. So it kind of depends upon what the nature is of what they're doing.
So Paul,
How far back?
You were going that we were talking about that. I got it.
Yeah.
I think we need to be careful.
Yeah, and, you know, if they're more modern records, we want to restore, you know, all the street listing books, you know, from 1900 to 2010, you know, that may be different than, something that's more historically significant to the town and not a bookkeeping responsibility of the town. The town clerks, they have a trade association just like the Community Preservation Coalition, and they have meetings and they have trainings and that sort of thing, and one town clerk stands up and I got $50,000 from my CPA program and I digitized all my records, you know, and all the other town clerks are like, whoa, that is great, you know, and they go back and apply, and you know, so it's a tough one. That's a gray area. That's a tough one. That's a really, and it's a local decision. There is no CPA police, right? That's just.
I was going to say, and if you make a mistake there, unless there's somebody in town that sues you, there's not the CPA police.
Yeah, that's the recourse. Or sometimes, you know, because the lawsuits are pretty rare, but they do happen. But a lot of more times it's credibility issues. You know, it's the article ending up on the front page of the newspaper. It's too bad there probably aren't too many newspapers left, but, you know, or someone throwing something back in your face. You know, like I had, you know, when we had a project turned down that people were really upset about. They didn't like the recreation thing we were doing because there were butters and there was going to be noise and parking and everything like that. And then they came after, you know, and wanted to examine every little thing we had ever done, you know, and you know, looking for all sorts of skeletons in the closet and that sort of thing. So at some point you're going to, you know, not every CPA project is perfectly, you know, copacetic, and not everyone loves to pay taxes for the greater good either. And so, you know, if you do things that are, you know, you might get away with it, but it might come back to haunt you later on in a PR or public records request way, you know. So something to be to think about. All right, rounded for home. I have 5 quick best practices that I can roll through pretty quick that I wanted to share with you. These are kind of the hot buttons from our technical assistance work over the past year of what people are asking about. The first is when you give money to a private organization, you know, it's public money, as we talked about going to a private organization. You really want to sign a contract with that organization. In CPA world, they're called grant agreements, but it's really a contract between the town and the nonprofit. And it has all the details listed here of what the project is going to do. And you avoid a lot of problems later on. You know, it even talks about payment schedule because mass procurement laws prohibit you from giving money up front to a third party. Municipalities can only pay after goods and services have been received. So you can't pay anything in advance, with very few exceptions in Massachusetts. So you can't just hand the nonprofit $50,000 ahead of time. They have to do the work and then apply for, show you that they've done the work, show you that the contract's been adhered to, and then you send them the $50,000. So grant agreements are critical. Do you guys use grant agreements when you're doing private?
We just added a clawback this last year.
Great.
And that created a huge problem.
Really? Just the presence of a clawback clause? Or you
The
tried to
union
claw back
Did
money?
not. They didn't feel that was fair.
To have a clawback clause? I mean, if things aren't done properly, they don't?
They were just so afraid that something could happen and the money would get pulled back.
Yeah. Well, pulling back money is a big process. It doesn't happen
The
overnight.
way it was described to us by the attorneys and the town administrator was, once you get the money, it's not gonna get clawed back.
Yeah,
But it's just like, they needed, it's, to take it seriously, that this is, you need to follow the rules.
Right.
This could happen.
tons of communities use clawback clauses. But each town attorney makes different decisions, you know? So did it end up getting in, or?
It was for a church.
Oh, it's for
So we're
church.
double.
We had another one on the church where they were going to be assessed a fee for the contractor showing up. They hadn't done anything, it's just for showing up. And we told them we can't pay them.
Right.
And so now it's delayed their project. They couldn't get it started this fall. They're gonna have to
Really?
do it in the spring.
Yeah, I mean, anytime public money is going to a third party, there are these issues. It's going to be hard, you know? It's just got to work through them. There's no magic bullet on those. All right, I hit the wrong button here, and now I probably don't know how to get rid of that. Oh, I did it. All right, so the second best practices I'll talk about is when you buy CPA lands, we're seeing some questions come up about the purpose of the acquisition. And this goes back to Article 97. For those of you who don't know, Article 97 is an amendment to our state's constitution that guarantees the public right to clean air, clean water, open space, parkland. And it says that if a municipality acquires land for conservation, recreation, park purposes, it will stay that way forever. And there is a process to undo that, but it's very onerous on the town. It's not to be taken lightly.
Yeah, and that's a very new regulation too. The whole process is.
The process, right. Article 97 has been around for 35 years, but they
Yeah.
strengthened it 2 years ago with a law called the Public Lands Protection Act, which finally, after 30 years of having Article 97, codified the steps that you need to take if you want to take it out of Article 97. So it's a process, and as it should be, you know. If we don't have a lot of land in Massachusetts, and the number one place that's easiest to build on is flat land that's open. You know, our farms, our fields, our forests, our soccer fields. You know, how many schools have been built on top of the soccer fields? You know, and then they replace the fields later, hopefully. So when you buy land with CPA funds, you really need to specify the purpose in that acquisition vote. And that goes back to your point. If everyone had done that on all the land you bought in the past, you wouldn't have had trouble figuring out what's protected and what's not, right?
Yeah.
So if you're going to buy it for, you know, conservation purposes, say that in the town meeting warrant, and, you know, say that in the presentation, everywhere. Same thing with recreation. You don't want to use the term open space. In the definitions section of CPA, you'll see that the word open space encompasses conservation land and parkland. So you use the word open space, that could mean the land is going to be protected as conservation land and not a tree is going to be cut, or it could mean every tree is going to be clear cut to build a soccer field. So just until we fix that, and we do need to fix that, that's not good the way the CPA is written with that. The term open space could mean conservation land or it could mean active park. So you want to be specific there. And same thing if you're buying land for historic resources and housing. This also is critical because the purpose of the land then dictates what type of restriction is going to be put on the land. Because whenever you buy something with CPA funds, you got to put a permanent restriction on it when you buy it. And so if it's unclear exactly what the land's going to be used for, you're not going to get the state agency in charge of housing to approve it unless it's clearly for housing. So this is an emerging issue that is really important to make sure is done when you buy land, which is not too often. So that's what I just talked about. Okay, last one. We kind of touched on this a little bit. When you're doing recreational projects, it's really important to make sure that that land is somehow permanently dedicated to recreation. We've talked about the different ways that Article 97 comes into play, whether it's under control of the Parks Department or the CONSCOM, whether the deed says it was acquired for park purposes or the town meeting vote says it was acquired for park purposes. Those are all clues as to what the land is actually for. And if it's for dedicated park and playground purposes, or playground purposes, that's great for CPA. That's what it's for. But if it's land that was acquired unrestricted or was acquired for another purpose, like for a library building, you know, it may look like a park around that building, but that's landscaping on a building lot, and that is not CPA eligible land. So you want to make sure that if it's restricted land, you use the restricted CPA funds. If it's unrestricted land, you use the unrestricted funding sources that are available to the town. Any questions on that? Does that make sense to folks? So this is the slide we already talked about. How can you tell? You know, it has a CR on it. We haven't talked about that. If it's got a CR on it, a conservation restriction, you know. If it's under control of some parks type committee, a recreational committee, if the purchase and the town meeting vote or the deed said that, if there was a transfer, a lot of towns transfer land, unused school. Actually, there was a vote at some town meeting, you could dig it up, to transfer control of this building that was under control of the school committee for school purposes to the select board for use for general municipal purposes, right? This was an old school that was turned into a town hall. There is definitely a town meeting vote buried somewhere that transferred control of this land. And that happens a lot with parkland, you know. And so it might be in an old vote somewhere. We talked about Article 97. This is the actual Article 97. We got ahead of ourselves a little bit. That's all it says. Yep. And that's all it said for 30 years. It was really subject to a lot of interpretation until we just got the Public Lands Protection Act that actually deciphers the legalese here and puts it into practice. But that's all Article 97 does, and it is a true amendment to our Constitution. It's not a law. It's more, you know.
Is it the last amendment to it?
You know, I don't know how many amendments we have. That's really a great question. I don't know how many amendments we have to our Constitution. I know the Anti-Aid Amendment is one of them, but I don't even know what number that is. That was 1856.
Right.
This was in the 70s. So that's a great question. I want to know the answer to that now. You've asked a good one. If you apply for a state park grant, they won't give it to you unless it's under the care of the Parks Department or Commission, or dedicated to some piece of legalese in state law that talks about parkland. So they take it very seriously, and CPC should do the same thing when the town is applying for recreation land. All right, we've spent a lot of time on housing today. You know, it is the hardest part of CPA. That Affordable Homes Act, you know, has a lot of money in there for housing, which was great. We had some money in the Affordable Homes Act, but it hit the cutting room floor in the dead of night in the conference committee on July 31st, unfortunately. We had some grants, as I mentioned before, John, that were going to go toward, the Senate passed their version of the Affordable Homes Act that had $50 million to be given to CPA communities that have met certain thresholds of housing work in their community. And we were really excited about that, but you know, every bill goes into conference committee and it's a private negotiation between the House and Senate, and unfortunately, when it came out, it was gone. As were hundreds of other line items and provisions. That's just the way the way the laws work sometimes, and we've got to keep trying on it. So the one thing I will tell you here is we have definitely got the attention of the legislature on the housing issue. And that has also put the spotlight on CPA, because CPA is one of the funding sources in the state on housing. And the legislature is looking a lot more closely about what CPA communities have done in the housing category. And I think any ability for us to get more state matching money in the future is going to hinge on how we're doing on the housing category. So it's definitely, the pressure's ratcheting up a little bit on communities in a lot of different ways. But it is the number one challenge to our state, is finding more affordable housing. So everyone's got to do their part. And I think we're going to suffer as a program a little bit until we really dig into this a little bit more. And then the last thing I'll leave with you with tonight is a little nugget, a little Easter egg buried in the law. Section 6 says that as the town holds your CPA money in their accounts, it's earning interest. The money is probably, there's no like checking account at, what's a local bank here? Do you have a Grafton Savings Bank? What's that?
Homefield.
Homefield, okay, there's no account at Homefield Bank, you know, the town's community preservation fund. Like, the money's just kept on the books of the town and mingled with all the other town free cash, and they keep track of it. But when they keep track of it, they're earning interest on all their money that is sitting in the savings account, or wherever it's sitting. And they're supposed to calculate how much of that interest is attributable to the CPA fund and pay that into the fund when they close the books on the town's affairs at the end of every fiscal year.
We did well this year.
What's that?
We did well this year with our interest.
I added this slide to my trainings about 2 years ago because it never used to amount to much, but then interest rates went up. And now we're seeing like Boston gets millions in interest on the money as it's sitting there, as it comes in before they send it out to projects. So it's good that you're getting it. Do you check that? Do you know if that's happening?
I think it is, but I want to double check.
Yeah. There's an easy way to do that. You just want to look at the CP2 form.
CP2, okay.
Yeah, CP2 is the form that the town has to submit
Yep.
to DOR, and there's a line on there about interest. And we have a link to the CP2 for every town in the entire history of this TPA program. We just finally got DOR to digitize all that and put it on their website, and we link to it from our website. So you can look up your own CP2 on the coalition's website.
So for the CP2, we submit that.
No,
Or
you
the
submit
CP5.
You submit the CP3, the projects, right.
Okay.
CP1 is, there's only 3 forms with CPA. CP1 is submitted by the town accountant, and it basically, all it says is, on September 15th, it says, we collected $472,522.16 from our CPA surcharge in FY24. Send us our matching money. That's all CP1 is. It just says how much money you raised from CPA last year so you can get your matching check. And that's done by the town every year by September 15th. The CP2 is the P&L statement, the profit and loss statement. It has everything about your CPA program. How much you started the year with, what different accounts the money's in. Is it in the historic reserve, the housing reserve? How much interest you earned, what you spent your money on in each of the categories, how much debt service you paid out of CPA, and what the closing balance was at the end of the fiscal year for all the different accounts. That's the CP2 done by the town. And the CP3 is the detail on your project expenditures, and that's done by the CPC usually, although sometimes town officials would do that for them. So those are the 3 forms.
And so from the CP2, they get the interest.
Yes, yep. And again, you can look up this link we have to DOR is great. We worked with them for about a year to build this database, and then they uploaded all the CP2s in going back like 15 years. And it shows, it's a big spreadsheet. It shows every one of those things I just talked about for every year in every town, which is great.
Is anybody at DOR checking that in fact they're paying interest, or no, they could send in with 0?
That is a great question.
Because when I asked my town, I've dealt with
Right.
2 different town accountants, and they're either very smart and look at me and go, oh, I don't know,
Right.
or they don't know.
Right. So in this process of uncovering the CP2s that were in DOR's records for the past 15 years or 20 years, and getting them to make those public and put them on their website and let everyone see, because so few CPCs no one ever gets a copy of the CP2. It's done electronically. It's a online password protected system that the accountants, put into DOR's database. There's not even a paper, I talk about it as a paper form, none of those are paper forms anymore. So a lot of times no one sees these forms. And what we learned, unfortunately, was that the forms have been feeding into the DOR database, and they were not really being looked at. And if they were being looked at, they weren't being looked at very closely. And we realized it when we saw and worked with DOR, and they put all these forms online, and we saw that dozens were missing, in FY 21, there were 42 communities that didn't file a CP2. In FY 23, there were 16. And we asked about it, and they said, we're really shorthanded, which they are. We don't have a lot of people, and this hasn't been a priority. But we understand. And so now, starting this year, they are requiring them, and they're following up with communities and making sure they do them, and they're looking at them. And then hopefully you're going to see what kind of errors are on there, because town accountants, it's a big job. It's hard, and mistakes happen all the time, and they're not intentional or anything like that, but it's a big job.
Because if we don't do the CP3, we jeopardize our match.
That's right. The
CP1 and CP2 are the same.
The CP1 is, if you don't submit a
You don't get a
CP1,
match.
you don't get a match. But that never has happened, because we don't want that to happen as an organization. So between September 1st and September 15th, Chase on our staff works every day, gets an update from DOR of who still hasn't submitted their CP1, and we call those towns and get them to submit it. Because the last thing we ever want is someone not to get their check. It's amazing how many, the town accountant leaves in August, and they don't really have someone to fill in, and they're closing the books on the town. It's crazy time, and it happens. So we've never had a community have their, CP1 not submitted, but if they don't submit a CP1, you will not get your check for a match. And the CP3 also was required to be submitted to get your match as well. And the CP2 does not have that same requirement. So, but DOR now is going to require it, but I don't think they've put into place a rule that says if you don't submit the CP2, you're not going to get your match.
So who's requiring the submissions?
Who's requiring the forms?
Yeah.
The Department of Revenue.
Okay,
Yeah, all three of them.
so it's not
Yep.
in the actual act, it's an accounting type of thing.
It's an informational guideline release, just what you were talking about. It's exactly what it is. It's DOR's official statement of the business of municipal record keeping, but it is not a regulation, it's not in the law, but it's their guidance.
Yep.
So there are probably thousands of things that fall in that area as well. So that's it that we have for you. Be in touch. If there's any other questions, I'll stay here tonight and answer them. As you can tell, I'm a little bit of a CPA geek, and I just love to talk about CPA forever. So anyone want to pull up a chair and break out some coffee, we'll stay till 1 a.m. if you want to. But otherwise, you can call, and we'll get you a copy of this presentation as
You have to go Google what was the last article added to the Massachusetts.
yeah, I do want to know that.
It's
Well,
121 times it's been amended.
Is it
oh, really?
So Article 97 is not,
But when was the last one? I'll bet you it was decades ago.
No. it
No?
was,
Oh, the gay marriage?
oh, it might, I
No.
don't know. It's
That
just-
was an amendment to our Constitution, I think. That was pretty recent.
Yeah, that
um,
could be.
I will tell you that the legislature has to, by law, convene a constitutional convention, like every 6 months, I think, or something like that. And they do it, and it's ceremonial, and they open the Constitutional Convention, and the House and Senate come together in one chamber. And they said, is there any business? And there's always the answer is no. And then they close the Constitutional Convention.
Seems
Sounds
like
like
there've been
there's
some
been
on
a
the
few.
ballots, but I couldn't tell you.
Well, a
what
ballot
they were.
amendment
But
is-
no, but that, didn't, we had to, as voters, to say, yes, we vote in favor of the constitutional amendment.
Yeah, are
Yes.
ballot questions changes to our state's constitution?
No, but I thought there were constitutional amendments.
Oh,
on
you're right.
ballots.
There's two types of ballot questions. There's one that just
Okay.
creates a law, and I love those because the legislature can then amend the law. Yeah, disregard it, cancel it, or
And
amend
almost
it.
all the amendments
Right.
were put first as a law, but didn't get through, then ends up on the ballot.
Right, because it's much, to do a constitutional amendment is a much higher threshold. They need like a lot more signatures. I think it has to go through, has to go through 2 sessions of the legislature and not get acted on, or get acted on, before you can even go
Seems
to
like
a,
there've been, you know,
there have.
few and far between, but there have been a few.
Yeah, you're right, you're right.
I don't have any.
Yeah, Glenn's furiously looking for when the last one was.
2022,
Oh, had to be something minor.
4% marginal tax on incomes over $1 million.
Oh, it's the millionaire's
that's right.
tax.
Millionaire
Okay.
tax.
That was a
Right.
constitutional amendment. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, because if it was a law, it would have gotten too easily to repeal it that way. That's why they did it as a constitutional amendment.
We all need to get
Interesting.
updates on
All right,
civics.
I take back what I said. So they've actually done some work at those constitutional conventions, a few of them, so. Any other questions I can help folks with, or?
I kind of have a sort of a question, you know, in all the different categories, the housing, open space, and historic, those always stay there. And then at the end of the year, the budget reserve and the administrative funds go back into the fund balance.
Right. Yep.
And then whatever you vote at town meeting will go in for the next fiscal year.
For the next fiscal year, that's right.
And then all the money that comes into CPA, does it always go into the fund balance during the year, like the,
During the year?
yeah?
Yeah, no. You do a budget during the year. You do a budget at town meeting in the
Yeah.
spring, and that says, we're gonna spend this $450,000, and then the tax revenue comes in, and it's applied to the reserve accounts in the budget. So if you put it in the housing reserve, it goes into the housing reserve. If you put it into your budgeted reserve, it goes into your budgeted
Right.
reserve. And then at the end of the year, anything that's unspent falls into one of the reserve accounts or the fund balance. So if your budgeted reserve, the proper way to do a budget is you put the 10% in each of the 3 reserves, you do all your projects, those get project accounts, and then you have 100,000 left over, you put that in a budgeted reserve. And that budgeted reserve, if it doesn't get used for a project throughout the year, that drops into your fund balance automatically at the end of the year. So there's a lot of things that drop into your fund balance at the end of the year. You mentioned the unused administrative account. The town will automatically, when they close the books, put that in your fund balance. The unspent budgeted reserve money goes into the fund balance. Any money that's been returned from other projects, if it was general designated money, that goes into the fund balance. If someone comes in and pays their taxes 2 years late and there's a CPA surcharge money in there, that'll get credited to your fund balance. If you expected a state match of $50,000, but you got $57,000, that extra $7,000 will go into the fund balance.
How about that interest money?
The interest money goes into the fund balance, yep, another good one. So there's a lot of, when the town's closing the books, this is why it's so complicated. They're just closing, that's all the stuff they have to do just to close the CPA account. And there's like 500 accounts on the town's books. But lots of little pots of unspent money goes into the fund balance. If you budgeted for $400,000 of local surcharge revenue and you got 410, that extra 10,000, there's no way for you to have spent that, that'll drop to the fund balance. So there's a lot of little things that will drop to the fund balance, and then that's available to you the next year to use along with your new money. So, great question. Yeah.
I had kind of like a chicken or an egg question.
Okay.
So if you had, so in Upton, we're trying to preserve a church. It's gonna be, I don't know if you're familiar with 19 Carter at all up in Berlin. They have, it's kind of like they kind of did the same thing that we're trying to do, where they preserve the church and they have.
Like a cultural
coffee
center?
house. Yeah, it's a cultural center.
Oh, I
So-
think I might have just presented in that building, actually.
Oh, did you?
Yeah,
Okay.
is there a big
Yeah.
hall in there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I did present in that. That's a fantastic
It
building.
is a fantastic building, yeah, they did a wonderful job. So we're trying to do a similar thing in Upton, and it's gonna be kind of a two-pronged approach where we have the 501c3, which is gonna need funding, and then we're gonna need funding for preserving the buildings. But I'm thinking about preserving the building right now, so I was wondering, getting back to the chicken or egg question, because we kind of need an architect to evaluate the building to figure out how much money we need to ask for.
Uh-huh.
But I was wondering, would you first need to get the architect and get or would we apply for funding for the CPA for the architect first, so you know how much you need to ask for? So would it be two separate asks, or would you bundle that together?
No, usually, we go back to the allowable uses chart.
Feasibility study?
Yeah, the feasibility study, the best way to do big capital projects is year one, you ask the CPA committee for all that feasibility money. So the
Okay.
architect, maybe designs, maybe building, building construction documents, bidding documents, or whatever. And that's a project. Like,
Okay.
and that's the first step on the rehabilitation of that building. It's
Okay.
all soft costs, and that's fine. And then, once you get all that information and you know exactly what you want to do, you go back the second year, because that usually, no matter what, it's going to take a year, right? It just, those things always take a year. I don't know why, but they take a year. And then you come back to town meeting, and then you ask for the $1.7 million to do all the work that the
Okay.
architect has uncovered. That's the best way. They can be all bundled at the same time.
Okay.
But the best way is you get a much more accurate picture of what it's going to cost.
Right, yeah.
You know, that way, doing it the way I described, you're not going to be short, or you're not going to just wildly guess and
Right.
and encumber all this money for a couple of years and realize you don't need it all, or you could never get the project off the ground.
Right.
Sometimes feasibility studies show that the project is not feasible.
Right.
And that's okay. You don't have to pay back the money. There's no clawback on that. That's the purpose of the feasibility study, is to figure it
Right.
out. Is the 501c3 already formed?
No, but I'm gonna try to, I'm gonna try and get that done, like, I'm hoping to get it done this month, hopefully.
Right.
There's a new 501c3 that's, so I just read or heard. It's very easy, it's on 20-page.
Oh,
Oh,
501c3 light?
It's like,
Don't you think?
it's for 501c3s, if you don't have a huge amount of income annually, you do what they call a postcard return. And I think that's the equivalent, this is a postcard application for a smaller, simpler 501c3. So I would look that up, because I
That'd be
did
great.
501c3 the hard way.
Yeah,
Now, who
I don't
owns
wanna
the-
do it the hard way.
Who owns the building?
The town.
The town, okay. So that, that is actually going to be then a town project.
Okay.
So the 501c3 can be all the Energizer Bunny for it, like they can do all the work with the architect and figure it all out and be the, go talk to the select board and advocate for it at a town meeting. But because the town owns the building, the application to the CPA has to come from the town board or committee that's in charge of that building.
Oh, okay, okay.
And because what the state procurement laws say, you've heard of the state laws about spending money, right?
Mhm.
You have to do bidding documents,
Mhm.
and you have to pay prevailing wage.
Mhm.
And a lot of times, that doubles the cost of a project. Doing a municipal project is expensive. We were doing new AC in our historic senior center because it was kind of rotting and moisture was deteriorating, and we got an estimate for $20,000. This was years ago. And I, as the CPC chair, met with the Council on Aging director and the vendor to talk about the project. And I said, can you remind me what the quote was for $20,000? He goes, yeah, for $20,000. Did it include this and this? And he says, let's pull out the quote. And then he's looking at the quote. He's like, oh my gosh, I forgot this was a quote for a municipality. And he takes out his pen and he scratches out 20,000 and he writes 40,000. And he hands it back to us. And we're like,
Prevailing wage.
it's like the same project. And he goes, yeah, but I forgot it was a municipal project. I got to do contract bidding and I got to win the bid and I got to, pay prevailing wage. It's going to be 40,000. So what a lot of people thought is, okay, let's form a nonprofit, the Friends of, what are you going to call this building? Or what is the building called? Friends of-
We're calling it Venue right now.
Okay,
Whole
the Friends of
project.
Venue.
Yeah.
And we'll apply for the funding, and we'll hire the contractor and do the work. And so now what you're doing, and we're going to apply for CPA money. So you're taking public money, and you're laundering it through a 501c3 and spending it on a public building. And the 501c3 is not doing the procurement and the prevailing wage, because you're not subject to procurement and prevailing wage.
Oh, okay.
But that's where people go to jail, because basically you're laundering public money through another organization to avoid
Oh, okay.
procurement and prevailing wage.
You can do a public-private partnership, which is what we did in town with the townhouse,
You can lease the building from the town.
which is what we did. We
Yeah.
had a long-term.
That's
lease
another
for
one.
$1 a year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're gonna have to have a lawyer helping you with all this, but
Oh, okay.
you could if you want control of the building and being able to do the projects yourself, I think you still have to pay prevailing wage, but you don't have to do bidding, I think is what it
would-
works.
I would think so,
Yeah.
because there's certain
Right, but I don't
thresholds and
think you have to do
everything else.
bidding anymore, if you own the lease on the building. So that's another way to do it too, and the town might be happy to offload the care of that building to your
Yeah, I
nonprofit
think they would love to do
for
an actual-
$1 a year for a lease, so it may make sense to have a lawyer look at getting you guys to lease the building from them, and then you'd control your own destiny a little bit. But for the feasibility stage, it's gonna take you a while to figure all that out.
Right,
What town board or committee is in charge of the building? Is it the select board or?
yeah,
Yeah, so talk with the select board and see if they'll submit an application, they'll have to do the bidding to hire the consultant and the architect, and they'll be working for the town, but, you guys will actually do the actual supervision and work with the architect and do all the work and that sort of thing.
oh, okay.
That's the best way to do it, because it'll take you a while to figure out a legal relationship with the town, and you want to get going to figure out if it's feasible or not.
Right.
So you just need a sponsor at the town, then the town's got to agree to hire this professional with the CPA money.
Don't underestimate how long it would take.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't you guys do some kind of project here like that?
The Grafton Town.
Yeah.
Is that the apple tree?
Yes.
Arts? Okay.
Paul
yeah.
was the
Yeah.
one friend,
Oh, okay.
If you want the roadmap for how to do these things right,
Yes, I did.
go buy that man a drink, because it was unbelievable.
I think I actually spoke to you on the phone
I think
a
we
couple
have.
months ago, yeah. 'Cause I heard the name Scarlett.
You told me the story of how you guys got that done, Paul. It was incredible.
It took years, but
It was incredible. Another one to look at is the Chelmsford Center for the Arts,
Oh, okay.
which was an old town hall in Chelmsford, which is now an arts center with an executive director, and they have concerts there and all sorts of things. And that's been around for over a decade. And we had our statewide conference there once. It's just such a beautiful historical building. So that's another model.
Okay.
Someone else had a hand up? Yeah,
I just wanted an example of, you talked about debt ceiling.
yeah,
Debt servicing.
Yep.
Project. Do you have an example of that?
sure. So the same way the town bonds for things against the future town revenue stream, if the town wants to buy a $500,000 fire truck or build a new high school, they're bonding against the future tax revenue of the town. You can bond against your CPA revenue stream. Which town were you from?
Shrewsbury.
Shrewsbury, okay, so you have a 1% surcharge?
Yeah.
Or 1.5?
One.
1. So the voters have given you a 1% revenue stream, which adds up to, I don't know, 800,000 a year or something?
Yeah.
Yeah. You can bond against that revenue stream. And you can go up to 30 years on the bond, so the debt service will fit nicely under what you have to spend every year. And that's really powerful, and over 2/3 of CPA communities have bonded against the future revenue stream.
Grafton has done 2 20-year bonds.
one was the townhouse.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of them, the other.
And have you bonded to buy land? Yeah, you bonded to buy open space.
Goes by quickly, yeah.
Yep, so Mendon bonded to buy open space?
Northridge bonded to buy open space.
Yeah, to buy the farm. Yep. Have you done anything, I
Yeah.
think?
Yeah.
Bonded to
Those 5 years.
rebuild
that's
it at
not
town hall.
Okay, there you go. So every other town in this room has done it. They're part of the 2/3. There's over $500 million in outstanding CPA bonds right now.
When you get a project that's, $1 million or more, that means bond.
Well, we have one park in town that requested $1 million.
That's a bond.
And we have 11 parks.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So that's an option. If you're interested in learning more about bonding, have you ever been to our website?
Oh, I'll go to you once.
Yeah, on the technical assistance page, we did a half-hour webinar just about everything you need to know to bond against CPA funds. And it's on that technical assistance tab.
I'll find it.
Yeah, right there. Look at that, CPA training webinars. There it is right there. So you hover over that.
Yeah.
This big menu opens up, hit that, and there are 2 general presentations, kind of like this one. And then the third one on the page is a half-hour, everything you need to know about CPA bonds.
Okay.
with all sorts of examples of other towns and spreadsheets you can download showing debt service and all that. And the data bank too. This has a report on it of every bonded project in every community since the beginning of CPA. It's on that data bank page. You'll have to hunt for it, but there's a big page of reports, and one of them is history of bonded projects with CPA, and it'll show town by town the date, what the project was, how much money was bonded, what the term of the bond was, whether it's 20 years, 30 years, 10 years.
What if a town repeals the?
That is the $64,000 question.
Close out CPA till you pay off your bond.
Right.
You can't pass any more projects, but you have to continue till your bond's
Until you,
paid off.
okay.
Yeah, it
That's
does
just-
not take away the ability of the town to revoke CPA. You can still revoke CPA, and you'll be considered a revoked community, but you'll have to keep CPA on the books until you've amassed enough money in your accounts to pay back that
To
bond.
pay everything.
And you won't be able to do any new projects. Everything will go toward those
Do you
bond
lose
payments.
your match?
You do not lose your match. We asked that question because someone
That'd
asked
be
us, and
great.
like, I don't know, it's never happened before, we don't know. And what DOR said was, as long as you are assessing a surcharge, you will get a match against that surcharge, even if you're a revoked community. So you're putting, now you would put that match toward the bond payment as well. Never happened because we've never had a community revoke CPA, so we've never had a community revoke CPA with bonds.
You know, every once in a while you hear about different organizations trying to change, whether it's CPA and other things. Is there anyone out there right now talking about changing, you know, CPC requirements or trying to change it or cut it
Oh.
or?
All the time, constantly. There's about 24 bills filed every year that we have to go up and testify about. Some of them good ideas, most of them not good ideas. And then we have our own slate that we get from ideas from the communities. There's been, I think, 11 amendments to CPA that we've done, all good. Not too many bad ones have passed that, you know, that we testified against. But yeah, there's discussions all the time. I just had a 2-hour discussion right before I came here with the legislative team at MAPC about what we might consider for future changes to the program, mostly to help the housing piece, like that carrot and stick, that's carrot versus a stick approach. We want to get ahead of it.
Especially if they want affordable housing in smaller communities, west of 128, where there's not much money, they're gonna have to make it a sizable, you know, it can't be a 50-50, one-for-one match.
Right.
It's gotta be a huge, 10-to-1 match, because even so, it's still, we just don't have enough money that's generated. If we threw 80% of our funds, it's still not
Right.
a dent.
Yeah.
you know.
Yep. I hear you. It's a modest funding source. So, thank you. Thank you all very much. Do you have something that you have to close a meeting, don't you, officially?
I want to thank everybody for coming. There's still, please take stuff home if you didn't get anything beforehand.
I did get some.
I know you came in late. Somebody came in late in the white sweater.
No, that's not me.
If
Oh,
you just
hi.
check off your name on
That's the
the.
guy. I was in your parking lot, and I couldn't see where the building was, and so I pressed Waze again, and it took me all the way to Sutton. and back.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. this
Sorry
is
about that.
screening ad.
I had, if it makes you feel any better, I got a great tour in my car of the high school, the tennis courts, the council on aging, the police station. I saw this, every piece of this complex before I found it. So, thank you all for coming.